Men in the Sand. Musings on Braxton McCoy's The Glass Factory. I sometimes sit back and muse on how different my beliefs about life and the world might have been if not for the influence of my two wonderful parents. They have permanently grounded me to a sure foundation through their tireless devotion to the gospel, love of their children, and loyalty to their country. They have always led by example, and I am forever indebted to them for showing me how to navigate life's path. Love you, Mom and Pop. An instrumental part of my family's story was my father's service in the global war on terror, referred to by an irritating and overused language device known as the acronym, a favorite device of the militaries. In this particular instance, the acronym GWOT, or GWOT. I recall, as a young kid, prying my dad for cool stories about killing terrorists, or flying in jets, or blowing things up with tanks. Unfortunately for my juvenile and violent mind, I did not get many gory stories out of my old man. What I did get, however, was a look into the mind of an introspective soldier. Pops is probably the most disciplined person I know, but simultaneously a great lover of fun and a devious prankster. He refers to his time in the GWOT as both the best and worst time of his life. He was, and is, ready at any moment to spill blood and forsake earthly goods for the American nation, but also sharply critical of useless foreign adventurism promoted by our elites for generations, wasting time, resources, and our country's young men for mere abstraction without care for national interests. The bundle of contradictions that he holds together in his mind are not unique to himself, but a common pattern among many of those men in the sand who fought in those faraway deserts not so long ago. If they are indeed contradictions. More on this later. Many books have been written on the GWOT, and surely many more will be written. Many of them are quite broad in scope, some are written quite well, and some of them just plain suck. I've read a few of these, and they seem to play many of the same notes. If we didn't know better, we might suspect that many GWOT authors simply copied each other's homework. Braxton McCoy's book is a welcome departure from the cacophony of sameness that surrounds the subject. It is not a book about foreign policy or the GWOT as a whole. It is not a political tome. It is not full of moralizing about war or lamenting the state of the world. The book, although technically an autobiography, is not self-absorbed or focused on Braxton alone. It is not a self-serving or inwardly focused tome. Instead, I feel that The Glass Factory is a story about the soldier, told through the lens of Braxton's life. I should not say his life, because that's too broad a descriptor. The book opens by describing the day he was blown up in Ramadi, Iraq, and continues telling the story of his life in the aftermath, starting day by day and then slowly zooming outward as the book's narrative churns onward. The style of writing is accessible, but not tacky. It's a book that's easy to read, but has enough depth to pull you out of the flow of time. There's essentially no unnecessary fluff, and the descriptions given of gory hospital surgery, experience with painkillers and alcohol, and playing with guns really draw you into the book. One problem I've seen with many autobiographical works is a tendency of the author to make themselves into a borderline fictional character, and that isn't the case with Braxton. He presents himself as a real flesh and blood human being. Kudos to him for not glamorizing or exaggerating his own life to make a more interesting book, instead of one that tells the truth unapologetically. And it does. Sergeant McCoy was quite close to death, which you will realize immediately upon reading the first two chapters, but which you can quickly forget as the book moves forward, if you become quite absorbed in the narrative. Ultimately, he sustained the following injuries from an Iraqi suicide bomber: femur, hip, humerus, radius, and ulnar bone fractures, hand and wrist fractures, a transected nerve, massive tissue damage, and shrapnel holes all over his body. As his body was slowly put back together over the years, he and the various medical personnel who fixed him up also found fractured ribs, neck damage, fused fingers, brain contusions, broken scaphoids, and a fracture in his lower spine. This stuff is nothing to sneeze at. It's the sort of thing that can destroy a person because the pain can be so overwhelming that one may wish for death instead. Braxton, in his own telling, almost went down this path once during an episode involving a bottle of whiskey, driving down a gravel road, and a .45 handgun. It's one of my favorite and least favorite stories in the book, because it demonstrates a subtext running through the whole of Braxton's book: our relationship to death. Your average American in the modern age is not well acquainted with death, which was not true of Americans in the past. We lived our lives as frontiersmen, with death waiting for us around every corner. The colonists who died of starvation, frostbite, and disease spring to mind, or the men who settled the Wild West, or, rather, both Wild Wests, surrounded by gunfire, wild animals, savage Indians, and broken bones that couldn't be operated on. Later, I think of the men in blue and gray who bled out in formation, thinking of their sweethearts back home, sometimes coming back home to a land they didn't recognize. Men wearing metal helmets who died in trenches or on boats or jumping out of airplanes fill my mind. These Americans knew death intimately. Its presence was as common and unremarkable as the sunrise and sunset. Modern Americans, however, run from death. It is just as inevitable as it ever was, but it remains shrouded and full of mystique. We don't talk about it in public, and not much in private either. Death is a whisper floating on the wind that we hope never floats onto our shoulders and leans into our ears saying, "Your time is up." Really, only two large groups of Americans buck this trend: our GWOT veterans and Bible-believing Christians. The latter is self-explanatory, but the former deserves some fuller examination. Veterans know what it's like to wonder about that friend they used to know and find out they left this mortal coil without saying goodbye. They know the feeling of inviting death to their dwelling instead of waiting for him to come knocking like everyone else. Vets have seen bodies that have been left behind by their souls, what it's like for someone to go from being someone you play cards with or pray with to being just a cold body. They know a graveyard better than most of us know the streets in our hometowns, and if they're not careful, they can spend more time thinking about death than about life. According to the narrative in Braxton's book, he's been in that sort of place before. I'm not saying that I think GWOT veterans are automatically paragons of virtue because of their familiarity with death, nor do I think most veterans would contend with me. I'm only saying that familiarity with death produces a certain kind of sobriety about the world, a sobriety that too many modern people lack. But this sobriety, again, does not mean avoidance of violence and death and war. It means reckoning with their proper place in the world. There is a point at which this familiarity is no longer sober but intoxicating, turning veterans into lovers of violence, something we ought not become. Ideas about death and violence must be held in tension, as a taut rope between 2 points, never cut in such a way as to allow the rope to swing to one side. If we can help it, we ought to know death well enough not to cower from it, but not so well that we revel in it. We ought to know violence well enough to use it in defense of good things, like our families, friends, neighborhoods, and nation, but not so well that it becomes our trade. We ought to put war in its proper place. God is, after all, the Lord of hosts, so that we do not become weak-willed and small-souled cowards, but we ought to avoid making war the full and ultimate end of man. Bundles of contradiction. A phrase I used earlier to describe what veterans can be. And indeed, it is true. Veterans can simultaneously be bold warriors in a combat zone just as much as they are cowards in an HR meeting, but it need not be so. King David is perhaps the best biblical example of how to be both a good soldier and a good man. He was, after all, the man after God's own heart, and therefore a man who is a model for us to emulate. It must be remembered, then, that David, in order to marry King Saul's daughter, killed 200 Philistines by his own hand. He was such a great killer that he was the leader of the mighty men, perhaps some of the greatest warriors in the ancient world, each one of whom could be credited with hundreds or thousands of kills in battle. David was capable of extraordinary violence, perhaps far more so than any other character in the biblical narrative. And yet, David is the man after God's own heart. He gives thanks to God, writes many songs of worship, and continually asks God's forgiveness with a fully repentant heart. He also prays that God would, quote, "Deliver me, O Lord, from evil men, preserve me from violent men, who plan evil things in their heart and stir up wars continually." This is the same man. And it should be noted that not only is David not condemned for his acts of conquest, but he is commended for finishing the work that God assigned Israel during the days of Joshua, defeating certain Canaanites whose abominable practices caused God to destroy them. Warriors can be men capable of great violence and yet still be good men. The soldier can be like Ernst Jünger, who described his relationship to opposing soldiers in the following way. Quote, "Throughout the war, it was always my endeavor to view my opponent without animus, and to form an opinion of him as a man on the basis of the courage he showed. I would always try and seek him out in combat and kill him, and I expected nothing else from him. But never did I entertain mean thoughts of him. When prisoners fell into my hands later on, I felt responsible for their safety and would always do everything in my power for them." End quote. Men who fought in bloody war can be against more of it happening. They are not anti-war so much as anti-unnecessary suffering. There is no contradiction and no hypocrisy, only an older and nobler understanding of a virtuous man. The soldier is a man civilization needs. These men, if called on again, would gladly give life and limb for this great nation. They are not universally virtuous, they are not always the knight in shining armor, and they are not always proud of every act in the fog of war. But they are capable of becoming virtuous because they have wrestled with real struggles, with real problems that others may run from. In the afterword to The Glass Factory, Braxton reflects on the purpose of the book. Quote, "What can we learn from this story? Authors are often told that they need an answer to this question before they even touch a pen. I didn't even have one articulated enough to aim at the outset. All that I know for certain is that I was telling the truth the best I know how. Letting one's heart bleed on paper might help another who is in chaos. Not everyone who reads this book will have been wounded in combat. I knew that much, but I think this story is universal in some sense. We all suffer." End quote. Indeed, soldiers know suffering, but in truth, so do the rest of us. We all know what it is to have pains in our bodies and souls, hope squandered, and lives fall apart. The question is only what we do with suffering, whether we wallow in it or confront it, whether we go it alone or lean on those who offer their hand. The virtues I've been talking about, those that I think manifest themselves in the soldier, are not developed through mere happenstance. They are forged through this sort of suffering, this sort of wrestling. C.S. Lewis noted that, quote, "Virtue is not democratic. She is achieved by those who pursue her more hotly than most men." Unquote. Virtue is not bestowed, but earned. It is my great hope that these GWOT soldiers are capable of such virtues. Many aspects of our nation's future fill me with dread, most of all the nagging feeling that younger generations have almost no role models to look to, men who are actually virtuous enough to be worth emulating. But if these men in the sand are more like Braxton McCoy than not, then this country is still capable of great things. Capable of virtuous war because it has virtuous men, it may someday soon begin to resemble founding America, a land full of the upright, ready to fight for God, family, and country. America may be, my country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, once more.